Great. Do you see my screen?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Well, third time is the charm, turns out. Thanks for having me back.
Thank you for being here.
I'm excited to share with you some of my research on one of my favorite species, whitebark pine. And I've been primarily focused in Sierra. So this will be a very Sierra-focused talk. So one of the greatest threats to ecosystems today is anthropogenic climate change. And while climate change is threatening forests globally, not all forests are experiencing the effects equally. For example, during the recent drought in California, which was attributed both to natural drivers as well as anthropogenic drivers, low elevation forests experienced this unprecedented mortality event, as shown here in Sequoia National Park. Well, high elevation forests, this is a whitebark pine dominated forest in the Sierra, appeared healthy. Just 1,000 feet higher above this devastating mortality, these forests seem completely oblivious to the plight of their neighbors. For scientists and managers, I think this came as a blessing, given that whitebark pine, a tree species that often dominates the subalpine zone in the Sierra, it's been experiencing dramatic declines throughout its range, leading to the recent listing under the Endangered Species Act. So these drought patterns led me to wonder, does it mean that some of these forests will remain unaffected by climate change? And could climate change actually improve growing conditions for these high elevation forests? When I asked local experts, nobody really knew the answer. There were a lot of great hypotheses, like maybe the drought was less severe at high elevations, or maybe bark beetles weren't able to reproduce at these elevations. And I also started wondering, how is it possible that we've been studying Sierran forests for centuries almost, and yet we know so little about these high elevation systems? Well, probably one of the reasons is that these high elevation forests in the Sierra are pretty inaccessible. There's a large amount of roadless wilderness, as shown here on this map, making it really challenging to study these forests. And as a result, this is a very quick Web of Science search, we have some pretty big gaps in our knowledge about how these forests will fare under rising temperatures and changes in drought severity. So to rigorously answer the question, will climate change improve growing conditions for whitebark pine in the Sierra, which of course is super important for managing this threatened species, we need to estimate both the magnitude of the impact of climate change as well as the adaptive capacity of this species. So today I'll be highlighting research from the past 10 years focused on the sort of many threats of whitebark pine in the Sierra. My talk is divided into 4 parts. The first will dive a little bit more into sort of the theoretical framing. The second will highlight the direct effects of climate change. The third, the indirect effects of climate change. And finally, we'll discuss a little bit about the variation and adaptive capacity of the species. So to flesh out sort of my previous statement about how we can rigorously estimate whitebark pine vulnerability to climate change, we needed to be able to estimate the magnitude of change as well as the adaptive capacity of the species. And the magnitude of change is really the sum of both direct and indirect impacts. Anthropogenic climate change, for example, is shifting climatic conditions under which whitebark pine is growing, which will likely have these direct effects on whitebark pine demography. These climate shifts are also changing disturbances and disturbance frequencies, which will indirectly shift whitebark pine demographic rates. These disturbances include abiotic and biotic disturbances, but today I'll be focused primarily on biotic agents. The degree to which whitebark pine-dominated systems can cope with these changes will depend on the adaptive capacity of the system. Adaptive capacity, like resilience, has been defined in myriad ways. I'm using the definition by Allen and Halling from 2010, which is adaptive capacity is often defined as the ability of a system to modify itself in response to social and ecological changes. The focus here is less on resilience and more on adaptive capacity, because I think the reality is Climate change is directional and it's a novel driver. And so the conversation is probably less about how much these whitebark pine forests can return to a historic state and much more about how well they are, sort of how capable they are of being flexible and changing in response to this driver. But before we get deeper into adaptive capacity, let's go back to talk about the magnitude of climate change effects, which brings me to part 2. So forests are responding differentially to the direct effects of warming. Some studies suggest that subalpine forests may experience ameliorated growing conditions as the climate warms, which can lead to increases in growth and productivity. However, other studies suggest warming effects are pretty variable, and some subalpine systems are experiencing declines in growth in response to warming. Even if there is a positive effect of global warming on tree growth, population-level research warns of increases in spatial synchrony across populations due to warming, which has been associated with higher vulnerability to mortality in many plant and animal populations. What do I mean by spatial synchrony? Well, temporal population fluctuations that are correlated across space. This time series shows very low synchrony. There is very little correlation across space and time in these plots, which are denoted by points, compared to this figure, which shows much higher in spatial synchrony, particularly at the later parts of this time series. Patterns of synchrony have been tested across many systems, including European forests, as shown here, where recent climate change has been attributed to increases in spatial synchrony. To date, however, no study has tested for changes in spatial synchrony across the whitebark pine range in the Sierra or the lower Sierra Nevada. And finally, no study has really looked comprehensively at the extreme drought effects across these forests, particularly at the tree level. So given the dearth of data and the variable patterns of warming and drought effects on subalpine forests globally, and the sort of dearth of data that we have in the Sierra, it's pretty unclear what the net direct effect of climate change will be on these systems. So for today, I'll focus on 3 questions to try to disentangle some of these impacts. The first is, what is the impact of global warming on whitebark pine in the Sierra Nevada? The second is, have patterns of spatial synchrony recently changed? And finally, what were the recent drought effects on whitebark pine? To answer these questions, I'll dive into a project that focused on whitebark pine throughout, again, the majority of its range in the Sierra Nevada. And the study captured the extremes of the environmental conditions under which whitebark pine grows in the Sierra. So it's sort of a factorial design where we looked at extremes in precipitation and temperature, as well as average conditions. And in total, 27 plots were selected across the range. And this was part of an amazing collaboration with Harold Zoll, Johnny Nesmith, and Phil Van Manchem, without whom this project would never have flown, because it was a huge endeavor. We multiple crews hiked into very remote regions in Sierra, from northern Tahoe all the way down to the southern tip of the range in Kings Canyon National Park. At each plot, we extracted between 20 and 30 tree cores from clumps or stems, like 1 stem per clump, to get a pretty nice breadth of environmental conditions in which whitebark pine grows. We extracted 772 tree cores in total, over 1,300 needle samples, and over 1,000 stable isotope signatures. And what we found was that we definitely are seeing increases in temperature over time. So this is max temperature and year on the x-axis. And certainly since the 1980s, there have been increases in mean temperatures. And that is, somewhat correlated with changes in tree growth. So we're seeing slight increases in RWI in response to probably these changing temperature conditions. The most parsimonious model included a quadratic temperature term. So this is max temperature and predicted RWI, rain width index, on the y-axis, which suggested that warming had both positive and negative effects on growth. And this is exactly what we find when we compare historic growth to recent, probably climate change induced growth. And we can compare these two scenarios using a counterfactual, which I'll explain a little bit later. But what this indicated was that really the only significant increases in growth were in these really cold regions. So this is temperature quantiles on the x-axis, and this is change in RWI attributed to warming temperatures. So again, we are seeing positive increases, but only in these really cold regions. And eventually that relationship becomes negative, but insignificant in the warmest regions of the Whitebark pine range in the Sierra. And when we project this across the landscape, across the range, we see that by 2099, growth is probably going to be declining across maybe up to 20% of the Whitebark pine range in the Sierra. And that's primarily here shown in yellow in the eastern sort of rain shadow slopes of the Sierra, where they are probably on average more water limited. But somewhat, I guess, good news is that almost 80% may experience increases in growth by 2099 relative to current conditions. And this is, particularly true for the southern Sierra very high elevation whitebark pine, which are very energy limited. So while this result may initially suggest that whitebark may be better off under these warming conditions, changes in spatial synchrony provide a more nuanced perspective. Working with a graduate student at the University of Wyoming, Caitlin Kimmel, in collaboration with her advisor, Lauren Shoemaker and Jonathan Walter, we tested for changes in spatial synchrony using the exact same data set. We developed a methodology to quantify spatial synchrony across multiple timescales, including using this sort of wavelet mean field approach, which essentially inputs RWI values from older trees that grew for more than 120 years, and then estimates the wavelet mean field for each plot. The colors shown here are indicating degrees of spatial synchrony. So high synchrony is denoted by red, and low synchrony is denoted by blue. This approach can also parse the different timescales in which synchrony is emerging or not. And on the y-axis here, it shows the timescales between 0 and 30, almost 40 years. And so we can start to see, are there differences in spatial synchrony across timescales that may be emerging in response to climate change? And what we found is that on average, spatial synchrony is increasing across all timescales. While it's very difficult to attribute these patterns to climate change in a really rigorous, precise way, given the methodology that we're using, we can certainly sort of look at trends, right, which are suggestive that this increase in spatial synchrony has something to do with warming conditions in the system. And if we look at changes in sensitivity, tree growth sensitivity to climatic factors across temperature quantiles, as shown in A and B, we can see that it looks like as these regions warm, or as you move into warmer regions, sensitivity to precipitation increases, as shown in A, while the sensitivity to temperature declines. And so it's likely that, partly what's happening here is that as the temperatures are warming, the trees are potentially becoming more water limited or sensitive to the water availability in the system, which is leading to this increase in spatial synchrony across the range in the Sierra. And this is also related to what we were seeing during extreme drought. So to predict drought effects, I used this nonlinear relationship between temperature and growth, which I hypothesized identified a threshold between energy limited growth and water limited growth, which is identifying where in the system water becomes really limiting on average. Using a Monte Carlo approach, I estimated this threshold to emerge around 8.4 degrees water year Celsius. And if this threshold identified that switch, we would expect to see very divergent responses, opposite responses to drought, right? If the energy limitation is real in the system and it persists through drought, we would expect that lower precipitation and increases in temperatures would extend the growing season, which would then lead to positive responses in the trees across a lot of different growth metrics, from stemwood growth to stable isotope ratios to needle growth. And that, of course, would be the opposite of what we would expect in water limited regions, which would, show that typical drought response where water limitation leads to declines in growth and photosynthesis. And that's kind of exactly what we saw. So we saw divergent responses in these energy limited regions where on average drought led to increases in growth. But as the system became water limited, above 8.4 degrees Celsius, that's where we started seeing average declines in growth in response to drought. And that was consistent across all of these different growth metrics. So this is showing difference in needle length during drought, so drought minus non-drought years. And we see increases in needle length in the energy limited regions below the threshold and decreases in needle length above that threshold. So again, there's very contrasting divergent responses depending on whether you're energy limited or water limited to drought. That was consistent in our stable carbon isotope ratios, which became much more negative in energy limited regions, suggesting that these trees were probably experiencing elevated gas exchange, which is often correlated with increases in growth as it is in this system. But then, in these water limited regions, we saw that typical drought response where the isotopic ratios became more positive. And what we found, I think, really interesting was that we didn't see a significant shift in the nitrogen isotope ratios in energy limited systems. They didn't seem responsive at all, or certainly not significantly, to changes in water availability. But that did shift in these water limited regions where on average the nitrogen isotope ratios became more positive. That actually maps on really well with this Crane et al. Study in 2009, and I wish they had a higher resolution image, but they don't, which basically showed exactly the same pattern. So this is foliar N15, and you can see, in these really cold regions, this is a global study, so really cold regions, we don't see any sort of significant relationship between temperature and N15, but about the same temperature threshold, around 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, we start seeing positive relationships between N15 and temperature. And I think what my co-authors and I sort of hypothesize is maybe what's happening in the system is that mycorrhizal associations are really dominating energy limited regions. These trees are N limited on average, and they're really dependent on mycorrhizae, which are not as responsive to changes in water availability, but soil N is. And so what's probably happening is as the system warms, organic N is becoming more prevalent in the system, so it's diversifying, trees are diversifying the sourcing of N. So this energy and water limitation is really driving a lot of these interesting divergent responses to climate change and to drought, and controlling a fair bit of growth and disturbance in these systems, which I'll get to in a bit. So in summary, extreme drought in the Sierra had a net positive effect on whitebark pine growth. But declines in growth in sort of these water limited regions, these eastern slopes of the Sierra in particular, were correlated with where we're seeing higher bark beetle outbreaks and mortality recently and sort of over the last 15 years. And that's corroborated by this recent study by Young et al. In 2023, which showed that, on average, we're seeing in the Sierra higher mortality in warmer regions. So I think this, energy limitation and water limitation, these are two ecohydrological classes that are really controlling so much of how these forests are responding to climate change, as well as the drivers of disturbance and the biotic agents, which are really where, climate change is having this indirect effect on these populations, including shifts in biotic agents like pathogens and bark beetles. So mountain pine beetle is this really aggressive bark beetle. It attacks whitebark pine, and as most of you know, it's contributed to precipitous declines in whitebark pine throughout its range. But historically in the Sierra, the mountain pine beetle outbreaks have been less severe, particularly in the southern Sierra Nevada. And that's also true for white pine blister rest, which is shown here. It's a lethal tree disease caused by the pathogen Crenardium rivicola. And again, the incidence in the Sierra Nevada declines as you move into the southern Sierra Nevada. While it hasn't been well tested, it's likely that these really harsh abiotic energy limited environments have been constraining the prevalence of these biotic agents in these systems. To understand how these environmental constraints might be mediating the frequency as well as changing the frequency of these biotic agents of mortality, I'm using data from 154 plots that were established between 1995 and 1999 in Sequoia Kings Canyon National Parks over here on the left. About 20 years later, I led a resurvey of these plots, and they were hugely adventurous to get to. It was a lot of fun. It was really challenging. It took us 5 years in total. Because in part they were placed, miles from trailheads. We would often have to climb over a pass, even if we were within, a mile of the plot. But we got to see some of the most remote regions of the lower 48, so it was completely worth it. To locate these plots, we were given these old notes that were written by the original surveyors that described how to find a rock with dimensions of 4 by 2 by 3, for example. And you're looking up at a landscape that looks like this with thousands of rocks that look like that. And you're thinking, no way am I going to find this metal marker that was drilled into a rock 20 years ago. But invariably we did. We found 154 of those markers. Some of them had fallen off. And we resurveyed every single tree looking for signs and symptoms of mountain pine beetle, white pine blister rust, and fire. And what the long-term data indicated was that, these biotic disturbances, as well as fire, typically occurred at much higher frequencies and lower elevations, which are these more water-limited regions. For example, bark beetle here, mountain pine beetle, this is in blue across elevation and the white pine hosts. And you can see sugar pine and western white, even during the drought, they were much more frequent in sugar pine and western white than in whitebark and foxtail pine. But it's likely that these biotic agents are starting to move upslope in response to warming temperatures. As we saw more recently, this was about 7 years later that this study showed that we're seeing spikes in mortality in the warmer regions that are, often driven by bark beetle, as well as shifts in where white pine blister rust is emerging on the landscape. And to test this, I compared a counterfactual scenario, which is a predicted almost control scenario where I used historic VPD and predicted a world in which climate did not affect white pine blister rust. And I compared that to the observed scenario where we did see climate change over the past 20 years. And the results from this analysis suggested we saw range expansions into higher elevations. So this is a map of Siki. And the blue range is showing where historically white pine blister has occurred about 20 years ago. And then the red is showing the range in expansion in response to climate change. But the range expansion was not, it was pretty asynchronous, or it was not proportional across space. And what we saw was that much lower elevations experienced declines, and very few infections increased at high elevations relatively. So we can visualize this slightly differently across elevation here. And this is the second survey in red and the first survey in blue. And you can see we saw much greater declines at low elevations than increases at high elevations. And this was indicative of a lot of really interesting interacting effects that we did not initially anticipate, but we were able to disentangle using a lot of different data sets. And what I think is really relevant for whitebark pine is that these patterns could be changing in the future because of this sort of divergent response to drought and warming that we're seeing. So in low elevations, sugar pine experienced that typical water-limited drought response where growth declined, photosynthesis was likely declining in response to closing of stomata in response to water limitation. And that's exactly what white pine blister rust uses to infect trees, right? It needs open stomata so it can infect into the needles. But that, of course, is changing at high elevation, where drought is actually extending the growing season. It seems to be associated with increased gas exchange, and as a result, stomata are probably open for longer periods of time in the summer, which increases the probability of infection. So under warming and drought, we're going to probably see divergent infection probabilities, which could be pretty threatening for whitebark pine in the future. So not only are these ecohydrological classes characterized by energy and water limitation, leading to these really divergent impacts on tree growth and productivity under climate change, they're also mediating shifts in these biotic agents. And in some cases, water-limited regions may be slightly less susceptible to white pine blister rust infection during drought, while these high elevation systems are probably becoming more vulnerable. But understanding whitebark pine vulnerability to climate change, of course, is not just about the magnitude of climate change, which is both direct and indirect effects. It's also understanding variation in adaptive capacity. And this is getting into some more preliminary research and sort of my current thoughts around how we want to be sort of measuring vulnerability, but also managing these systems. Which brings me to part 4 of this talk. So my current working hypothesis is that these energy limited systems really have lower adaptive capacity, in part because they've long adapted to climatic conditions that were generally inhospitable to disturbances. There are many mechanisms that can help enable trees to adapt to changing environmental conditions, including selection pressure, dispersal, facilitation, demographic rates, and responsiveness or plasticity. And they emerge across different temporal and spatial scales. Because climate change is this rapid change in the system, it's a novel change, it's probably important to that these sort of mechanisms that act at faster time scales, those mechanisms are probably going to be more important in the face of climate change. And unfortunately for energy limited systems, that's not great news because recruitment rates are they're lower. And if you move in from low elevation water limited systems to high elevation energy limited systems, recruitment rates typically decline. And so that means they simply can't recover as quickly to disturbance, right, compared to their water limited counterparts. There's some good news, I think, related to defense mechanisms. which appear to be relatively plastic in whitebark pine. This is a really cool study that was published last year that shows variation in resin ducts across time, which this is a photo up here showing the resin ducts in tree rings, which are really important for defense against any biotic attack. And density as well as duct area increased through time, suggesting that maybe climate change is shifting the production of resin, which is related to defensibility. And as it warms, it's likely that these trees do have somewhat of a plastic response, and they can become more defensible against biotic attack. However, working with UC Davis student Jennifer Cribbs on a study that's comparing resin duct production across the White Pines and the Sierra from low elevation to high elevation, what we sort of our very preliminary data are indicating is that generally resin ducts seem to be declining in production across elevation, which means that we're probably seeing a limit to that plastic response and defense response as climate is warming, and that species is also the species themselves are going to limit the degree to which these trees will be defensible to changes in biotic agents. So as temperatures and extremes are predicted to increase in the future, I think it's going to be increasingly important to understand and estimate how climate change will be affecting whitebark pine, especially if we want to develop effective restoration and conservation strategies. The working papers that I just presented on, I think have summarized the fact that, we are seeing pretty complex and very highly context dependent effects on whitebark pine populations so far in the Sierra Nevada. On average, climate change is leading to increases in growth, which is a positive effect that seems to be associated with increases in vulnerability to mortality given the concurrent increases in spatial synchrony. So yes, there's positive effects of climate change, but those effects are also increasing vulnerability to mortality at a population level. The impact of climate change is, I think, mediated by this energy water limitation threshold. And energy limited regions of the whitebark pine range, they have lower adaptive capacity probably on average than water limited regions because they've co-evolved with fewer biotic agents and disturbance regimes. But at the same time, even though these water limited regions probably have slightly higher adaptive capacity, the magnitude of climate change effects is likely more negative. So none of this evidence suggests that whitebark pine persistence is not threatened by climate change. I think there's varying threats, and the degree to which those threats will impact these populations will be different depending on where these trees are growing and what they've historically been exposed to. But just because they're growing in high elevation systems that seem to be experiencing some positive responses to climate change doesn't mean that we shouldn't be worried about high elevation whitebark pine in the Sierra. So with that, I'd like to thank my incredible collaborators who made all of this research possible, because it is not easy to do. It also takes quite a bit of money to do this kind of work. So thank you so much to my funders, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Joan. Sorry, that was a wonderful talk. I'm so excited. I have questions for you if no one else does, but let's see. First, if anyone has questions for Joan, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can enable you to ask your question aloud. Okay, maybe in the meantime, I'll go ahead and ask one then. So I really like the framework you presented of energy limited systems versus water limited systems across an elevation gradient. In some cases, though, high elevation systems are more water limited than energy limited, or perhaps this is happening as climate warms. Are you anticipating a shift in, I guess, the pivot point for where a system is more energy limited or water limited, or do you think that this varies spatially?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So I think what I was identifying was like the underlying causal relationship to some degree between temperature and water limitation and how that affects growth. And so it's not, I don't think it'll be the threshold temperature that will change, right? It's always going to be around, like for the Sierra Nevada, around 8.4 degrees Celsius, but it's definitely going to be changing in space. So as the climate is warming, temperatures, of course, are increasing. And so where that threshold emerges across the population is probably moving upslope to some degree. There's some variability in that depending on the like microclimate variation. But on average, I would say we're, given what the projected declines in growth will be by 2099 in whitebark pine, it's suggesting that water limitation is increasing across the range. So the spatial extent of water limitation is moving upslope, which suggests that threshold is moving upslope.
That makes sense. And do you think about this differently with growth limitation for adult trees versus like a seedling establishment niche?
Definitely, yes. And I think so. These were all adult trees. That's a really great question. And I think the energy water limitation sort of threshold could be very different for the understory or other vegetation and recruiting populations, because the microclimate in which their root systems are totally different. The microclimates that they're exposed to are totally different. We do see water limitation emerging quite quickly in the summer for like shallow rooted vegetation. So I would imagine that would be true for the seedlings. So seedlings may on average be much more water limited than energy limited relative to adults, which have deeper roots.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's what we're seeing with limber pine seedlings in the Rocky Mountain, in the Central Rocky Mountains.
Yeah,
It would be really interesting to think about changes in viable seed production as water limitation is seen at higher and higher elevations, and as those lower elevation trees are water stressed and perhaps producing fewer seeds, and then also, seed dispersal and whether that seedling niche is whether there are viable seedling niches at higher elevations, as we see that like shrink in the range at the lower elevations due to water limitation.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, in some cases, it's potentially positive. Like water limitation is part of the reality of water limited systems. But they're actually more productive on average, because they have this really long growing season. So as long as they have enough water each year, even though they're water limited, they can grow more. And so there's that interesting tension between, like, in some ways, like energy limitation is terrible for trees on average relative to water limitation. I think trees on average would prefer to be water limited. But how that plays out across, demographic stages, and then if there's like, mismatches in how these trees are able to respond based on those demographic mismatches and like niche space, as you're talking about, that could be really interesting to disentangle and would really help, I think, help us understand how these trees might be migrating or limited in their migration.
Absolutely. I agree completely. And I think that would be really interesting to look into. I see you also have some other questions. Let's see. Okay. Enzo posted one. Did you find whitebark pine regeneration in wildfire burn areas? We're seeing a lot in the strawberry range.
Very cool. We didn't have
That's
any
John.
burned plot, or I didn't survey any burn plots at high elevation. More recently, we've had more burns, but the burn footprints are so small that they often didn't cover any of our plots. I think, yeah, there's some really interesting questions around higher water, my hypothesis, as you mentioned, Laurel, is that, you know, these high elevation seedlings are probably on average more water limited, and then the, you know, fire footprint, especially if it's high severity, would exacerbate that potentially. And so depending on, you know, if it's a wet year or a dry year, we probably see pretty distinct recruitment and fire footprints.
Thank you. Let's see, and then this was so depending on which link folks clicked in the email, they may be showing up as ENSO. So I apologize if I'm not crediting people properly for their questions. Please feel free to include your name with your question just in case. Thank you for bearing with us on that. So this question, in the Northern Rocky Mountains, increases in temperature allows competing conifer species with more rapid growth potential to move up in elevation and directly compete with whitebark pine. Negative effects on whitebark pine are sometimes the result of new competition with more rapidly growing species that formerly weren't present at these higher elevation sites. Have you investigated impacts of competition?
No, but that is a fascinating question. And yeah, it's an additional component to, I think, the elevated vulnerability of whitebark pine, especially in these more water limited regions, because I think that is where we will see trees that historically were constrained by energy limitation to be able to move upslope. You know, I think we'll see more recruitment of lower elevation species in these water limited regions of the range. So that could, you know, certainly amplify the negative effects of climate change very broadly, with these different mechanisms of competition, changing biotic agent frequencies, and increased drought vulnerability. So yeah, not great news for whitebark, and something we should definitely be considering in the Sierra.
Yeah, absolutely. Although it's possible that those competing species are even less drought adapted. So maybe they wouldn't be the competitors that we might expect them to be under scenarios of no water limitation.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Open question. Okay, from Mason, between energy limited to water limited regions, have you found a Goldilocks zone? With an eye for future restoration, or maybe if I'm wondering if I'm interpreting this right, Mason, assisted migration?
Interesting question. We did find, so Phil Van Mankham's led this study where we were combining variation in we had a genetic component, so we're looking at genotypic variation across the whitebark pine range in the Sierra, and the eastern slopes seem to be pretty distinct from the majority of the whitebark pine population in the Sierra, suggesting, and we need to do more studies on this, like a, you know, common garden experiment to really determine whether or not that's related to drought tolerance. But I think there might be some indication that, you know, those populations, if they're planted in the Goldilocks zone, would probably be, you know, somewhere not in really energy limited zones, but, you know, around the sort of peak of that threshold, which is really where productivity for whitebark is on average the highest. So you're probably likely to have some, you know, success if you plant a whitebark pine in that zone. And then if it's also more drought adapted, then you're probably likely to have, you know, a pretty successful restoration plan or, you know, outcome. But that is my hypothesis. And that definitely needs to be tested. And there's a lot of additional data that we need to be able to say that definitively.
Thank you. A great response. Actually, so sort of related to that, unless does anyone have their hand up? Oh, this is a comment, I think. Oh, wait, no. So I'm not sure who this is, but they say, really great talk, Joan. You're doing amazing work. I was curious to hear more about the preliminary studies finding decreased resin duct production across higher elevations in the Sierra. We have found an opposite trend, increased resin duct production with warming temps at our high elevation whitebark study sites in western Montana and eastern Idaho. So just curious about this work and implications for tree defense, potentially with changing latitude. Thanks.
That's a fantastic question. And that was actually getting exactly at my point for this talk, which is that I think there is some plasticity, right? And how these trees will be able to defend themselves. So the defense response being they can produce more resin ducts in response to warming across, within a species. But then if you compare across species, different white pine hosts like sugar pine to whitebark pine, the species themselves are, only so plastic, and there's a limit on sort of the total number of resin ducts that they can probably produce by species. And so if biotic agents become as frequent as they are in lower elevation systems where sugar pine and western white pine are currently dominating, I think that's, pretty bad news for whitebark, which seems to be a little bit more limited in its ability to produce resin. The the sort of defensibility is a little bit lower relative to its lower elevation white pine relatives.
That is unfortunate.
That's very preliminary data, however. So stay tuned. In about 2 years, hopefully we'll have more results there.
Yeah, it would be interesting to know if that varies across, like, between populations, and
Exactly.
how much variability.
Yeah. And that, because it seems like there is this plasticity, right? Like they are able to respond to warming temperatures and they become more defensible in warming temperatures, but that does seem to be limited by the species identity.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Hi, Joan. That was an excellent talk. Thanks. Did you take those stunning photos of the Sierra Nevada scenery?
Yeah, I did. Yes, I'm a big fan of my system. If I could have a different career for sliding door career, it probably would be a photographer.
They were really, really wonderful photos, and I'm a bit jealous. It looks like a wonderful place to explore and take around.
It is, but so are all white pine systems. Whitebark pine
is true. Yeah,
it's really the ideal study system. The Colorado Rockies are incredible.
Oh yeah, no complaints here. Yeah. But if you ever need help in the field, let's see. I'm not seeing other questions yet. I have one. This might be considered controversial, maybe not. So I'm thinking about the graphic that you made, showing like slower shifts, slower response at higher elevations, like by whitebark pine at higher elevations, and faster negative response than positive response at lower elevations. And then thinking about the multiple biotic pressures and how those might intensify with changing climate. What are your thoughts on assisted migration for whitebark
pine? I think it is controversial.
Yeah, that's fair. If it's not something that you're prepared to answer, I understand.
I don't want to go on record about any of it.
Okay,
but
yeah.
I would think that there's a lot of opportunity for that. And especially because it is a threatened species, we need really proactive strategies to support its persistence in the long term. And I think, it's I think there's a lot of opportunities for assisted migration that we should be considering.
That seems like a fair response. I'm sorry to put you on the spot like that. I'm enjoying thinking about that for sure.
Yeah. Are you thinking about assisted migration in your system?
Not implementing it, but it's just something that I've been thinking about more recently with respect to white pine, five-needle white pine conservation in general, because these are such slow-growing species, and because of the difficulties with, well, not difficulties with dispersal, but there are complex interactions between viable seed production, masting, and the support of the nutcracker population. And then also, it's an open question whether nutcrackers will move seeds to microsites that are amenable in the context of climate change. So it, I think it's worth thinking about, and I would enjoy having more conversations with people about that, certainly.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that so far Clark's nutcracker does not seem to be so affected, or like my understanding is that it doesn't seem to be so negatively impacted by climate change. And so we have the disperser in the system. We could take advantage of that.
That is true. It is helpful.
It's helpful.
Yeah, but I'm curious about populations of Clark's nutcrackers on the northern end of the range, for example, and, whether they would they truly be enticed to disperse seeds to areas where whitebark is not abundant, or would that be counter to their behaviors? But I'm getting into territory that is very speculative for me personally. So
I know we need more ornithologists. I feel like we just don't have enough that are focused on Clark's nutcracker.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Aaron Shanahan said, I think we should all be thinking of that, and then listed a couple of programs, I believe, that I should probably do.
Climate smart, conservation, and RAD. Yes, I think that's the reality that we're facing for at least now. And the thing that gives me a little pause, I think, is that these trees live for up to 2,000 years. And if we project climate warming out 2,000 years, what does that really look like? There's a lot of uncertainty about how much warming we'll see in the future. And so I think it's really understanding, like, what's sort of the maximum warming we're expecting to see on the landscape, given that, humans are currently adapting and trying to shift the trajectory of our future. And then, where we're given those sort of scenarios, where should we be implementing these more controversial strategies? Oh, great. There's somebody working on Clark's nutcracker. Fantastic. He'll have to give a presentation. I'd love to hear about it.
Yes, absolutely. Karina, we should talk.
Yeah.
So I think we're about out of time. Let's see. Thank you so much, Joan. I really appreciate your flexibility, and I'm really glad that third time was the charm and that we were able to get you on the webinar. So let's see, our next webinar will be in 2 weeks. And Libby Pansing and Wes Swaffer will be presenting. Sorry, one moment. On research and restoration, American forest role in recovering whitebark pine. So please tune in for that. And I would recommend subscribing to the webinar if you haven't already, and using the link in the calendar invite to join us next time. Thank you so much.